Marcus Chen didn't just play poker, he dominated it, and on this particular Friday night in his Manhattan penthouse, he was doing exactly that. The five men around the table represented over $3 billion in combined net worth, but Marcus had already taken 40,000 from them in the past 2 hours, and he wasn't done yet. The cigar smoke hung thick in the air, swirling under the custom chandelier that had cost more than most people's houses, while the city sprawled out behind them through floor-to-ceiling windows like a kingdom at their feet. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and surveyed his opponents with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up wounded prey. He'd built his hedge fund from nothing into a $200 million empire by the age of 32, and he'd done it by never backing down, never showing weakness, and never ever losing. Tonight was no different, except that Richard Langford, the oil executive across from him who'd just lost another 10 grand, was getting visibly frustrated, his face flushed red from expensive scotch and wounded pride. Marcus could smell blood in the water, and he was circling. Richard threw his cards down with more force than necessary, the slap of pasteboard on felt echoing in the sudden silence that followed. "You're too damn cocky, Chen," Richard muttered, reaching for his glass with a hand that shook slightly, whether from alcohol or anger. Marcus couldn't tell and didn't care. There's confident, and then there's you, and eventually that arrogance is going to cost you something you can't buy back. The other men shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension ratcheting up beyond the normal competitive banter that usually characterized these games. Marcus just smiled, that shark's smile that had unnerved countless competitors across boardroom tables from here to Hong Kong, and took a slow sip of his own drink, savoring both the burn of the liquor and the moment. "Is that right?" he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of amused contempt that he'd perfected over years of making grown men feel small. "Because from where I'm sitting, Richard, my arrogance just won me your money, your watch, and apparently your peace of mind." The room erupted in nervous laughter from the other three players, but Richard wasn't laughing. He was staring at Marcus with something harder than anger, something that looked almost like pity, which was ridiculous because Richard had just lost $20,000, and Marcus was up 45. "All right then," Richard said slowly, his words deliberate now, the alcohol-induced slur suddenly gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. "Let's make this interesting, Chen. Let's see just how far that arrogance of yours really goes." Marcus set his glass down with a deliberate clink, every eye in the room now fixed on the two men as the atmosphere shifted from friendly competition to something else entirely, something with edges sharp enough to draw blood. "I'm listening," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he was humoring Richard rather than actually interested. But there was something in the older man's eyes that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up just slightly, some warning his lizard brain was trying to send that his ego immediately overrode. Richard stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked to the window, his back to the table as he looked out over the glittering cityscape below. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a knife through butter. "You think you're untouchable, Chen? You think your money, your success, your perfect life, makes you better than everyone else, immune to the things that break ordinary people?" He turned back to face the table, and his expression was unreadable. "So here's my challenge, my dare if you will, and I'll put $1 million on the table right now if you're man enough to accept it." The room went absolutely silent, except for the faint hum of the city below, and the distant sound of a siren somewhere in the Manhattan night. Marcus felt his pulse quicken despite himself, because $1 million was serious money even for him, and the looks on the other players' faces told him this wasn't just another rich man's ego game anymore. This was something different. "What's the dare?" Marcus asked, and he hated that his voice came out slightly less confident than he intended, slightly more curious, like Richard had actually gotten under his skin. "I want you to give a homeless person your personal cell phone number," Richard said, the words dropping into the silence, like stones into still water. "Not your assistant's number, not some burner phone, your actual number, the one your clients use, your family, your whole life. Write it down, hand it to them, tell them to call you if they ever need anything, and then actually answer when they call." Marcus laughed. He couldn't help it, because this was the stupidest dare he'd ever heard, and he'd been expecting something actually difficult, something that would require real sacrifice or courage. That's it, he said, still chuckling. Give my number to some random bum and answer their calls. Richard, you're going to give me $1 million for that. Are you drunk or just getting senile? But Richard wasn't smiling, and neither were the other men at the table now. They were watching Marcus with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to almost sad, like they could see something he couldn't, like they knew something about the world that his success had insulated him from understanding. There's one more condition, Richard continued, pulling out his phone and opening his banking app with practiced ease. You have to do it tonight, right now. We all go with you. You can't screen the person, can't interview them or pick someone who looks safe or manageable. We walk out onto the street, and you give your number to the first homeless person we encounter, and then for 1 full year you have to answer every single call from that number, no matter when it comes, no matter what they want, no matter how inconvenient it is. Richard's thumb hovered over the transfer button on his phone screen. You ignore even one call, you block the number, you change your own number, you send your assistant to handle them instead of going yourself, and you lose. And you pay me $2 million, but if you make it the full year, answer every call, help with whatever they ask within reason, then I transfer you $1 million and admit in front of everyone here that Marcus Chen is the most committed man I've ever met. The dare hung in the air like smoke, and Marcus could feel the weight of it now, could sense the trap that Richard had laid, even if he couldn't quite see its exact shape yet. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of these men, not when they were all watching him with those expressions that suggested they thought he'd refuse, that they thought he wasn't brave enough or committed enough or human enough to accept. You're going to pay me $1 million to be a good Samaritan for a year, Marcus said, standing up and buttoning his jacket with sharp, decisive movements. Richard, I don't know what kind of psychological game you think you're playing here, but you got yourself a deal. Let's go find me a homeless person right now, so you can start processing that transfer. The other 3 men exchanged glances but didn't say anything as Richard pulled up a digital contract on his tablet, something he'd apparently prepared in advance, which should have been another warning sign, but Marcus was too fired up now, too committed to proving he was better than whatever Richard thought he was. They all signed it. The terms were clear: 1 year, answer every call, provide reasonable assistance when requested, no delegating, no blocking, no avoiding, and the stakes were set. 1 million to Marcus if he succeeded, 2 million to Richard if he failed. 10 minutes later, all 6 men were on the street. The autumn air, sharp and cold after the climate-controlled comfort of the penthouse, their expensive shoes clicking on concrete as they walked down Madison Avenue, looking for someone who needed what Marcus had never needed in his entire privileged life: help from a stranger. They didn't have to walk far because New York was full of people the system had failed, people who'd fallen through the cracks that men like Marcus and Richard stepped over every single day without a second thought, and huddled in the doorway of a closed bookstore with a thin blanket and a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps, God bless," was a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. Marcus approached her with his business card already in hand, the thick cream-colored paper with his name embossed in gold letters, looking absurdly out of place in this context, and he crouched down to her level, something he'd never done before for anyone, getting close enough to smell the street on her, close enough to see that her eyes were brown and clear, and watching him with the particular awareness of someone who'd learned that nothing came without a price. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual and failing, because how do you sound casual when you're a man in a $3,000 suit, talking to a woman wrapped in a blanket that wouldn't sell for $3 at a thrift store? I know this is going to sound strange, but I want to give you my personal phone number. If you ever need anything at all, you can call me. I'll answer. I'll help however I can. No strings attached, no catch, just here." He held out the card, and she didn't take it immediately. She just looked at him with those brown eyes that had seen too much for someone so young, looked past him at the other men in suits watching this interaction, like it was a theater performance they'd paid to see, and Marcus could practically see her calculating whether this was some kind of cruel joke, whether taking the card would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was rough, hoarse, like she didn't use it much anymore. like there weren't many people worth talking to in her world. Marcus hesitated, because he couldn't exactly say, because I made a bet for $1 million, that would make him look even worse than he already did. So instead he said, because everyone deserves to have someone they can call, and even though it was a lie, or at least not the whole truth, something in his voice must have sounded sincere, because she slowly reached out and took the card from his hand. Her fingers were cold when they brushed against his, cold in a way that made him suddenly aware of how warm he was, how comfortable, how safe his entire life had always been. She looked at the card, reading his name aloud quietly, Marcus Chen, Chen Capital Management, and then she looked back up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I'm Sarah, she said, and Marcus realized with a start that he hadn't asked her name, hadn't thought, because in his mind she'd just been the homeless person he needed to complete his dare, not an actual individual with an identity and a story and a life that had led her to this doorway on this cold October night. Nice to meet you, Sarah, he said, and stood up, his knees cracking slightly from the crouch, making him feel older than his 32 years. The first call came at 3:17 in the morning, exactly 6 days later, and Marcus was deep in the kind of sleep that only people without real problems ever achieved, dreamless and complete, when his phone started buzzing on the nightstand with a number he didn't recognize but somehow knew immediately who it was. He lay there for 10 seconds, staring at the screen in the darkness of his bedroom, and he thought about ignoring it, thought about how easy it would be to claim he'd slept through it, claim his phone had been on silent, but Richard's words echoed in his head. Answer every single call, and besides, 6 other men knew about this dare and would know if he failed, would know he wasn't man enough to keep his word for even a single week. Marcus swiped to answer and brought the phone to his ear, his voice rough with sleep and irritation when he spoke. This is Marcus, he said, trying to sound awake and alert and like being woken up at 3 in the morning by a homeless woman. Wasn't bothering him at all. Marcus, it's Sarah, from the street last week. You gave me your card, you said to call if I needed anything. Her voice was different now, tight with some emotion he couldn't identify, fear maybe, or pain, and he could hear street sounds in the background, voices, traffic, the ambient noise of the city that never actually slept. Yeah, Sarah, I remember, Marcus said, sitting up now and running a hand through his hair, glancing at his floor-to-ceiling windows that showed Manhattan spread out below him like a circuit board. What's going on? Are you okay? There was a pause, long enough that he thought maybe she'd hung up, but then she spoke again and her voice was quieter, almost embarrassed. I'm at the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital. Something happened. Someone tried to, it doesn't matter, but they're asking me for an emergency contact and I don't have anyone, I don't have family here, I don't have friends anymore, and I know this is weird, but you said I could call and I can't put nobody, they won't let me stay if I don't have someone. Marcus closed his eyes and took a deep breath, because this was exactly the kind of thing he'd hoped wouldn't happen, the kind of real actual human need that required him to do more than just answer a phone. But the dare was the dare, and $2 million was $2 million and more than that. Something about the way her voice had cracked when she said I don't have anyone made his chest feel tight in a way he didn't entirely understand or appreciate. Put me down as your emergency contact, he heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to say them. Give them my name and this number, I'll come down there right now. What's your room number? St. Mary's Hospital emergency room at 3:45 in the morning was nothing like the pristine private medical facilities Marcus was used to, where appointments were scheduled, where everything was clean and quiet and efficient, where people who looked like him were treated with immediate deference and care. This was chaos, barely controlled chaos, with the smell of antiseptic failing to mask other smells he didn't want to identify, with people moaning in pain and babies crying, and a television in the corner playing some infomercial to an audience of exhausted souls who'd been waiting for hours. Marcus approached the nurse's station, acutely aware that his hurriedly thrown-on clothes, designer sweatpants and a cashmere hoodie that cost more than most people here made in a month, marked him as someone who didn't belong in this world, and the nurse looked up at him with the tired patience of someone who'd seen everything and was impressed by nothing. I'm looking for Sarah, he said, and then realized he didn't know her last name, had never asked, which seemed like an absurd oversight now. She called me. I'm her emergency contact. She said to come down here. She's in the ER somewhere. The nurse typed something into her computer, her long nails clicking on the keys with practiced efficiency, and Marcus caught her glancing at him with an expression that might have been suspicion or might have been curiosity. "Sarah Mitchell?" she asked, still looking at her screen. "Room 7, curtain area, straight back and to the left, but visiting hours are, well, technically she's your emergency contact, so I guess that's different. Go ahead." Marcus navigated through the maze of curtained area, past other people's private medical emergencies that were anything but private in this environment, and found Sarah sitting on an examination table in a paper gown, her street clothes folded on a chair, and she looked small and young and frightened in a way that made Marcus suddenly feel guilty for every complaint he'd ever had about his life. There was a bruise forming on her left cheek, dark and ugly, and her right wrist was wrapped in a bandage, and when she saw him her eyes went wide with surprise, like she hadn't actually expected him to show up, like people not keeping their promises to her was just another fact of life she'd learned to accept. "You came," she said, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement of disbelief. "I said I would," Marcus replied, moving closer and then stopping, unsure of what to do, how to act, what the protocol was for this situation that fell so far outside his normal experience. "What happened? Are you okay?" Sarah looked down at her bandaged wrist and then back up at him, and Marcus saw her making a decision, saw the exact moment she chose to trust him with truth instead of the easy lies she probably told most people. "There's a guy at the shelter where I usually try to get a bed when it's cold. He's been bothering me for weeks, saying things, following me around, and tonight he found me at my spot, the doorway where you met me, and he wanted to." She stopped, swallowing hard, and Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, hot and immediate anger at this unnamed man, and at the world that put Sarah in situations where she had to fight off predators just to exist. "I fought back," she continued, her voice steadier now, almost proud. "I had a glass bottle, I found earlier, and I broke it on the wall and cut him with it when he grabbed me. Cut his arm pretty bad, I think, and he ran off, but I cut my own wrist doing it, not deep, just enough to need stitches. And then the cops came because someone heard us fighting, and they brought me here instead of arresting me, which I guess is something." She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just exhaustion and resignation and the grim acceptance of someone who'd learned that survival was its own kind of victory. Marcus didn't know what to say, didn't have any words that seemed adequate for this reality that existed parallel to his own comfortable existence but might as well have been on another planet. "I'm sorry," he finally said, and it sounded pathetically inadequate even to his own ears. But Sarah just shrugged. "Not your fault," she said. "Not anyone's fault except his. And mine for being stupid enough to stay in that doorway when I knew he knew where to find me. But the thing is, Mark, and I'm telling you this because you came here in the middle of the night when you didn't have to, and I guess that means something. The thing is, I'm tired. I'm so tired of being this person, of living this life, of being scared all the time and cold all the time and hungry most of the time, and I don't know how to get out. I tried. I had a job once, had an apartment, had a normal life. But then I got sick, got pneumonia, lost the job because I missed too many days, lost the apartment because I couldn't pay rent. And once you're down here, once you're at this level, it's like quicksand. Every time you try to climb out, you just sink deeper." She was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks, and Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been sealed shut for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Marcus made a decision that night in that curtained hospital room that had nothing to do with the bet or the money or proving Richard wrong, and it had everything to do with the look in Sarah's eyes when she'd said, "I don't know how to get out," because he realized that he did know. He had resources and connections and the kind of privilege that could open doors that were bolted shut for people like Sarah. He pulled out his phone and started making calls, and he didn't care that it was 4 a.m, didn't care that he was calling in favors from people who would remember this. Because what was the point of having power if you never used it for anything that mattered? By 6 a.m., when the doctor finally finished Sarah's stitches and discharged her with prescriptions she couldn't afford to fill, and instructions for follow-up care she'd never receive, Marcus had arranged for her to check into a residential program that specialized in helping homeless individuals transition back to stability, a place with counseling and job training and temporary housing, and he'd paid for 6 months up front, and he'd called his lawyer to set up a trust that would continue funding her care beyond that if she needed it. Sarah stood outside the hospital in her street clothes with a plastic bag containing discharge papers and pain medication samples, staring at Marcus like he'd just told her she could fly. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. And this time Marcus told her the truth. "Because a friend dared me to give you my phone number to prove a point about my arrogance, and he was right. I was arrogant. I am arrogant. I thought answering your calls would be some minor inconvenience I'd have to tolerate for a year to win $1 million. But you called me tonight, and I really saw for the first time how much of life is just luck, just circumstance, just being born into the right situation, with the right support, and you deserve a chance. Not because of some bet, but because you're a person who's trying and the system failed you, and I have the ability to help, so I should help. It's that simple." The year wasn't simple. Sarah called him 17 more times over the next 12 months, sometimes for emergencies, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to share good news like when she got her first paycheck from her new job, or found an apartment, or enrolled in community college classes, and Marcus answered every single call. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about the money, and started being about being the person he'd always told himself he was, but had never actually proven. When the year ended and Richard transferred the $1 million, Marcus immediately transferred it to Sarah's trust fund, didn't even think twice about it, and when Richard asked him why at their next poker game, Marcus just smiled and said, "Because I finally figured out what actually makes someone rich, and it's not the money."